The Glassworker is a hand-drawn 2D animated film from Pakistan, and I don't think it's good. But before you get mad at me, hear me out. Oh, and if you haven't seen the movie yet, just know that there will be spoilers in this video. First of all, I want to say that I mean no disrespect to the artists, animators, or voice actors that worked on this movie. Pakistan had no real hand-drawn animation industry, so what they've managed to accomplish is laudable. One could nitpick, of course, but they should feel very proud of themselves. Especially since it seems that they had no easy job making this movie. The other thing I want to get out of the way is that I am Pakistani. In fact, I'm very Pakistani. And it's because I'm Pakistani that I'm making this video at all. I, like so many Pakistanis, was very excited for this movie to come out. I wanted it to do well. And I know that as Pakistanis, we're very supportive people. Everyone likes to come out and give each other a pat on the back for even trying to do something. But because I care, I'm not going to do that. If we want to produce things of actual artistic merit, we have to be honest. We have to be honest about what works and what doesn't work, about what's good and what's bad, and honest about what sucks. So don't think of this as some blind attack. This is the plea of a Pakistani that wants Pakistanis to do well. Anyways, here are my main, sometimes overlapping points. First of all, that the movie is derivative. Second of all, that it represents nothing and nobody. And thirdly, that it's just badly written. Again, first of all, and most painfully, the movie is incredibly derivative. It lacks originality in a fundamental sense. To make sense of what I mean, it's important to note where this all hinges upon. And it's with this man here, Hayao Miyazaki, who runs Studio Ghibli, an animation studio in Japan and probably the #1 hand-drawn animation studio in the world. Studio Ghibli has been part of the conversation surrounding this movie since its inception, with various media mentions and appearances and YouTube videos saying just as much. The Glassworker has been referred to as being both inspired by Ghibli as well as an, quote, homage to Ghibli. And while there's nothing wrong with drawing inspiration from established artists and industry legends, everyone does it to some extent, I think the case of the Glassworker is a problematic one. In a few words, I think the Glassworker crosses past that line of mere inspiration and is teetering on the edge of just being a poor copy. Put simply, there is a difference between inspiration and imitation, and I'm afraid that the Glassworker is on the wrong side of that line. The so-called Ghibli inspiration was such an important part of the marketing around Mano Animations and their film, The Glassworker, that the studio's founder even went to Studio Ghibli itself to learn more about 2D animation. It was, of course, very generous on Ghibli's part to let them in to learn about 2D animation and to give Pakistan that help in creating its own. However, I feel like there's something disingenuous about the framing of this visit and this whole Ghibli homage style marketing. It feels like these things were just used or are just being used as a cover for the studio to basically copy Ghibli's art style and yet make it seem like Mano Animation Studios had Ghibli's blessing in doing this. As I said, the art style at times does more than just draw inspiration from Ghibli, but looks almost like it's just a pale imitation of Ghibli's works. On the left here is a fire demon by Ghibli, for example, and on the right is a djinn by Mano Animation Studio. And anyone that's familiar with Ghibli's works will know what I mean. If you've seen Howl's Moving Castle, for instance, you'll notice how similar the settings, the clothes, and of course the actual animation style is. It's impossible not to raise your eyes at various points when you watch The Glassworker. And beyond the art style, even the music sounds very similar to the works of Ghibli's Joe Hisaishi. I encourage you to listen to the music in the film and some of Hisaishi's works, especially those for Howl's Moving Castle, and tell me one doesn't sound like a knockoff version of the other. The makers of The Glassworker make no attempt to even hide their, quote, inspiration, but their style so closely follows Ghibli as to make one question, what in here is actually unique to Mano Animation Studio at all? Are we just trying to do Ghibli while not being Ghibli? The overall feeling a viewer gets after watching The Glassworker is that of, we have Ghibli at home. The whole movie looks, sounds, and feels like it's trying to be Ghibli, except it's not as good. Some of the media surrounding the movie even says things to the effect of, quote, the movie's inspired by Ghibli, but with its own spin. But these articles never can actually stop to identify what this supposed spin is, nor can I identify any unique impression or imprint left by the movie. This is especially ironic, given that the protagonist of The Glassworker, Vincent, at one point makes the claim that unless one makes original work from one's own imagination, they're not really an artist. Again, while I don't fundamentally agree with Vincent's point, it's funny that by their own metric, the makers of this movie aren't making art at all. But I digress. Even the plot doesn't escape the clear over-reliance on a distillation of Ghibli styles, themes, and leitmotifs. If you've seen any Ghibli movies, you know that an anti-war theme is very, very common for those works. Consider, for instance, Howl's Moving Castle. Set in a fictionalized European setting, it has a war in the background and strong anti-war themes. There's even a sentient flame and a love story. And every one of those phrases was also true of The Glassworker. And of course, there's nothing wrong with doing an anti-war movie. Ghibli doesn't have a monopoly on anti-war content, nor should it. The problem is that this movie does not seem to have any real grasp of its own theme and therefore says nothing interesting, original, or profound. Interestingly, unlike Howl's Moving Castle, which is a children's movie at heart, The Glassworker is not a children's movie. There's literally gore in it. There's a scene where Vincent's father has his arm violently ripped off, basically exploded. And the war in The Glassworker is also much more fleshed out, in some sense, than the one in the Howl's Moving Castle. We see soldiers dying in the front lines. Vincent's father, as we'll discuss shortly, refers to how the war is being fought over mineral wealth and agricultural land. So the Glassworker seems to want to tackle this anti-war theme from a more adult perspective, but the film actually has a more childish view of war than the actual children's content. Which leads me nicely to my next point, that the movie represents nothing and no one. Going back to what Vincent's father says about the war, early in the film, Thomas, his father, explains to Vincent why the war is happening. He says, "The Great Ravine is disputed territory. There's great mineral wealth, some of the finest agricultural land. We claim it, so do they. So we go to war. Idiocy." Vincent then asks his father, "Then who owns the land?" His father replies, "Vincent, the only land that concerns me is that on which our glassworks stand on, and the beach below with its fine sand." So basically, despite the context under which all Pakistani people live, and the times in which this film was released, they chose to make the statement that what happens in other countries and to other people's lands should not concern us, which is especially odd. It's especially concerning since the movie's target audience, Pakistanis, have the lived context being aware of the Kashmir issue. And given that the makers of this movie are also Pakistani, it's impossible to not think that they also had Kashmir in mind when they wrote that dialogue for Thomas. This leads one to question, does Mano Animation Studio believe that the Kashmir dispute is merely about, quote, mineral wealth or agricultural land? Is there no moral imperative in the issue? Is the idiocy mentioned here your way of calling Pakistanis idiots for caring about the people in Kashmir? Furthermore, the anti-war stance is doubly horrendous when you think about it in terms of the greater geopolitical context of the world at this very moment. Think about what's happening in Palestine. Thomas says, "We claim it, so do they." Is it the glassworkers' contention that the Palestinians are idiots to care about their own land? Is it their contention also that since we're not Palestinian, we shouldn't care? Since, again, as Thomas says, the only land that concerns him is his own. And also, as a passing point, it's very interesting that he says it's idiocy to fight over this disputed territory over mineral wealth and fine agricultural land. But then when he's talking about the only land he cares about, which is his own house, he says he also cares about its fine sand. So it's idiotic to care about mineral wealth, but I really like the mineral wealth of my land. In a nutshell, it's quite clear then that this movie does not represent Pakistan, Pakistanis, or Muslims. And of course, you're not under any obligation to make art that does just that. There's no reason that Mano could not have made a movie set in Europe with nothing to do with Pakistan. But that was not the claim. The claim this movie and its makers made to Pakistanis, and the way they got Pakistanis interested in investing in and lining up to watch this movie, was by stressing that it was homegrown, that it was Pakistani, that there were jinn and Urdu newspapers and gulab jamun and shalwar kameezes. So we can and we must take the Glassworker to account for failing to do the very simple thing it claimed it would do, which is represent us. Consider even the names of the characters. The protagonist is named Vincent. His love interest is General ki beti Elise, who, I must remind you, is a ginger with green eyes. We also have her father, also with green eyes, Colonel Amano, a name of uncertain origin, as well as the protagonist's father, who is named Thomas, because even Thomas was apparently too Pakistani for this movie. In fact, the only character that has any relevance or substantial weight in the plot is this guy, Malik Khan, and we're supposed to dislike this character. He's Vincent's romantic rival and even bullies Vincent earlier in the movie for his pacifistic views. So the only main-ish character with a Pakistani name is, in simple terms, the bad guy. Pay attention also to the skin tone of these protagonists. They're all light-skinned. Is this a representative sample of Pakistanis? Why are none of the main characters dark-skinned? The darkest one among them looks at best like he got a tan at the beach. This makes me ask, do we hate ourselves? Does the team working on this, like, what's wrong with dark skin? Why do these people have to be white passing to be main characters? On top of all of this, even the setting fails to be representative. The characters live in Waterfront Town, a city so European looking I thought we were in Austria. And this is particularly confusing and hurtful when you watch the documentary that Mano Animation Studios uploaded on its YouTube about the making of this movie. There, they mention in seemingly loving terms that the city of Karachi was an inspiration. But as anyone who has lived in or been to Karachi will know, this is ridiculous and looks nothing like Karachi. In fact, there's only one building in Waterfront Town that you could say is based on an actual building in Karachi, and they make this claim in the documentary, and it's this one. And I think it says a lot that the one real building that actually influenced the art direction for Waterfront Town was a colonial-era building built by the British colonists and named Empress Market after Queen Victoria. Because that's obviously the best way to represent Pakistani culture, is celebrate the architecture of our colonists. The food in this movie is also an interesting case. It seems that in their attempts to follow Ghibli to a T, they wanted to have these shots of appetizing looking food, which is sort of something that Ghibli is famous for. But what the hell is this? For the love of God, does any Pakistani that's watching this, does any Pakistani who has seen this movie, do any of you know what that is on the left? Because the movie is so derivative and clings so desperately at the coattails of Studio Ghibli, they never stop to seriously consider how to represent the people and the culture that they claim to represent beyond this superficial level that we see. Think about it. None of the main characters are dark-skinned, as we discussed earlier. There are no hijabi main or even side characters. There is no masjid in this movie. And of course, they might counter that there are non-Muslim Pakistanis and that you don't have to be a Muslim to be a Pakistani, but that doesn't change the fact that masjids are a common and fundamental part of a cityscape in any part of Pakistan. So their omission is bizarre no matter how you slice it. 4. The voice actors all have British accents. This is also frustrating because it's as if they're pretending that Pakistanis don't speak English. Like they don't teach English in schools in Pakistan. As if I'm not speaking English to you right now and I don't have a British accent. 5. For the most part, only side characters dress in culturally relevant ways. Now, if we wanted to point fingers, it would be easy to do so. It was a bit jarring for me to find out that the script wasn't even written by a Pakistani. And again, it would be the easiest thing in the world to point a finger at Miss O'Shea. But in good conscience, I can't do that. It's not her fault, really, because the problem, I think, is much deeper. I cannot fault the screenwriter, the artist, or anyone else beyond some small level when it is quite clear that from its onset, this movie was not a sincere attempt to represent us. Pretending to represent us is a means to an end for this movie. Any attempt to attach itself to Pakistan, or any of these surface-level presentations of Pakistani culture that you see, such as a shalwar kameez in the background, or someone wanting to eat a gulab jamun, these exist only to get the movie more attention. I mean, think about it. Like I said, the entire feeling you get watching this movie is we have Ghibli at home. If it weren't for the fact this is Pakistan's first and only 2D hand-drawn animation, what reason would anybody have to watch it? And in doing so, in taking advantage of this sort of ephemera of Pakistani culture, the movie takes advantage of Pakistanis. It takes advantage of their kindness and their supportiveness. It takes advantage of how starved they are of culturally relevant or representative media. and it does this while not actually caring about representing us. But setting that aside, the Glassworker also has some more fundamental problems. Perhaps you don't care about it being derivative or unrepresentative. Perhaps you're not Pakistani and that doesn't quite matter to you. But the fundamental fact is, even ignoring those things, the writing is just bad. There's hardly anything of substance in terms of the plot, and the movie is riddled with what we can call roads to nowhere. These are plot lines that are introduced and then seemingly abandoned and leading to nowhere. For instance, early in the movie, Vincent asks his father why he can't go to school like the other boys. His dad tells him basically that he doesn't need to go to school since he's going to be a glass worker. And then we get this dejected shot of Vincent, which implies that perhaps, just maybe, he doesn't want to be a glass worker. This is never discussed or mentioned again. This is the only time we see this, and it literally never comes up again, as if there's no internal turmoil here. Then, going back to the whole anti-war, woke anti-war spiel the movie's trying to give us, consider the Great Ravine and the war that's embroiled the characters of this movie. By the end of the movie, there's no elaboration for the viewer of what's actually happened. Was there a ceasefire? A lasting peace? Will tensions flare up again? What happened to the war? I don't know. The viewer doesn't know. The movie in its last moments seems to merely forget that there was a war it was concerned with at all. And then there is the scene where Vincent is responsible for his father's arm exploding. First of all, the writing in the scene is so comically bad that it's hard to take seriously. So Tomas's arm is tied up to a heavy object, which Vincent is very slowly pushing off a cliff. And in the 5 business days it takes Vincent to finally shove it off the edge of this cliff, rather than telling Vincent at any point, stop, my hand's caught in the rope, Tomas just says, wait, and then quietly tries to disentangle himself while Vincent does not, in fact, wait. This also takes place near the end of the movie, so there's hardly enough time for this to have much of any impact on the plot in the first place. There simply isn't enough time in the movie to do anything with this. And it's also just never addressed again. There's never a moment of anger or resentment on Tomas's part. Never a moment where he's even angry at his son. We don't see a moment where, think about it, Tomas makes his living with his hands. He's a glass worker. He makes his living with his hands, and he's lost his hands because of his idiot son. And yet we see no confrontation, no apology, nothing. He simply loses his arm, and that's it. Also near the end of this movie, Elise and her family, as well as Malik Khan, are all summarily blown up. I'm not kidding, that's it, they're just blown up. There's also the jinn, which is introduced early in the movie, and somehow has both too much plot relevance and then none at all. We first see the jinn in the beginning, where it guides Vincent to read a letter from Elise. Later in the movie, Vincent explains the jinn's powers to Elise, and that there are good and bad jinn. At one point, it guides Elise to look into a window where Vincent was standing a moment ago. And then we don't see the jinn again for the most part until near the end, where the jinn seemingly possesses Vincent and tries to get him to engage in what is basically an act of domestic terrorism in an attempt to blow up some planes. We then see the jinn in the final scene, where it literally takes Elise's form and tries to seduce Vincent, but I'll speak of that shortly. So in all, the jinn is a completely incoherent element. It seems to be shipping Elise and Vincent, but then it also decides to be a silly, goofy guy and murder some of Waterfront Town's troops. But then also maybe it wants to sleep with Vincent. I can't tell. I really can't tell. It suffices also to say that you could actually have removed all the scenes with the jinn or any reference to a jinn, and nothing would have changed. It would have done nothing to affect the plot. But it gets weirder for some reason, like I mentioned. While the jinn seem to be, like I said earlier, shipping Elise and Vincent, there's this bizarre moment at the very end where the jinn turns into Elise and is making googly eyes at Vincent. Bear in mind, this is after Elise has been blown up, and bear also in mind that this is after this jinn has tried to blow up a few planes. And then Vincent and the jinn have like a nice play date at the beach or something. It's not really clear. Is he sleeping with the jinn? I don't know. I don't know why they thought that they had to put this in there. I don't know whose idea this was. I don't know why they thought this made any sense. It made me feel something which honestly was emblematic of how I was left feeling by most of the writing, which was, what was the point of all that? The writing overall is flabbergasting and incoherent. And the problem is not merely limited to the broader strokes of the plot. Take this scene, for instance. Vincent and Elise are in the train station and literally get bombed. They are walking through a civilian train station, which is largely made of glass, and they have multiple bombs dropped on them. The building is wrecked, things are on fire, presumably most of the people, their townsfolk, are dead, and Vincent and Elise are running, they're horrified, they take cover behind something. And 5 seconds later, still inside the station where they almost died during a lull in the bombing, they have the following conversation. We should wait for the all clear. That's what we were taught at school. And by the way, there's never an actual all clear for the end of the scene from what I remember, but that's besides the point. I was scared. I was scared too. I've never seen a bomb before. Pa will be wondering where I am. Mother will too, I think. Which, first of all, I think? Before I even read the last line of dialogue here, who talks like this? Like, literally, who talks like this? But anyways, Vincent then says, the market is quiet. I wouldn't mind some gulab jamun. Are you kidding me? This is so bad. It almost feels racist. He literally just got bombed. He almost died. This girl that he presumably loves almost died. And not half a minute later, he's thinking of gulab jamun. Did a human being write this script? Did anyone involved in the writing of this scene stop to think, after I had a bomb dropped on me, and I'm surrounded by fire, dead bodies, and the ruins of my town's train station, would I have an appetite for gulab jamun? Would I be in the mood for sweet dough deep fried in syrup? Like, are we that? Is this like a joke about us, like Pakistan having like a high diabetes rate? Like, what is going on here? And here's another excerpt from the same scene, by the way. I'm not going to marry anyone. I'm going to be a great violinist. But for all your musical ability, you will never be an artist. I'll never be a... What do you mean by that? You only interpret what someone else has written. You do not create. What I do is original, from my imagination. This is a bizarre turn for the conversation to take. A, because, as I just said, they've just been bombed and almost died. And B, because it feels like a very hard 180 in terms of characterization of either of the characters or the themes of the movie. Where did Vincent get this chip on his shoulder from all of a sudden? There was never a moment earlier in the film where he was felt he was some sort of authority on what it meant to be a creative. Nor was this a common or a strong theme earlier in the movie that had been portrayed to the viewer hitherto. Yet somehow, after almost dying, Vincent decides to roast the girl he presumably loves for not being, quote, a real artist. It's nonsensical. Who talks like this? Who would talk like this? Especially after a bomb was dropped on you and there are presumably corpses of townsfolk, some of whom you probably recognize and know, littered around you. Who would stop to argue about the nature of creativity? Especially since this is the creativity in question. This is Vincent's art. I'm just going to move on. That's besides the point. In all, let me say this much. There is no excuse for bad writing. I understand that Pakistan hasn't had a hand-drawn 2D animated film before, and so I'm not nitpicking the quality of the art or the animation. But that doesn't matter in terms of the writing. The lack of an industry, or a lack of forerunners, or any of these things are not an excuse for bad writing decisions. In fact, there really is no excuse. You had over a decade to write this movie. There's no excuse for bad writing. And anyways, that's about enough out of me. To sum up, I want to reiterate, I really wanted this movie to do well. I wanted it to succeed. I wanted it to blow me away. And no, I didn't want Pano Animation Studios, I didn't want this movie to be the next Ghibli. I didn't want the next Ghibli to come out of Pakistan. I wanted Mano to be better than Ghibli. But this is not what I was hoping for, and this is not what any Pakistani was hoping for. Yeah, we're supportive people, so you'll still get a lot of kind words. But if we want to make something great, we need to be real with ourselves. So, to the makers of The Glassworker, I hope you'll take some of what I had to say into consideration when you work on your next project. I hope you make something that actually represents us and celebrates our culture. And next time, if you do something like that, I hope you knock it out of the park.